Have you ever noticed how a thought can come out of nowhere and still completely dominate your day? How does a silent idea, almost imperceptible at first, grow inside you until it steals your peace, your sleep, and even your faith? And the most disturbing thing is not that, it's the fact that many times you don't even realize when you've lost control of what you're thinking. How many nights have you spent reliving situations, creating scenarios, feeding fears that never happened, and yet feeling like they're real? There is a place inside you where no one else enters, a quiet place where voices don't make noise but have power. And that's exactly where the biggest battles of your life are happening right now. Thoughts that are repeated, that insist, that wear out, as if it were a constant echo that you can't turn off. And the more you try to ignore it, the more they seem to grow. It's as if something invisible is trying to occupy this space, shape your emotions, influence your decisions, without you realizing it. But what if I told you that there is something hidden in all this? Something that has always been in front of your eyes, but that you have never been taught to use in the right way. A kind of spiritual key, simple in appearance, but powerful enough to completely change the course of your mind, and consequently, of his life. Something that is not distant nor inaccessible, but which remains hidden from those who have never been taught to see. Because the truth is that not every thought that comes to you belongs to you. And there is a path, little talked about, that reveals how to filter, protect, and even transform what goes through your mind. A path that does not begin from the outside, but in the deepest part of its interior, where God is already at work, even in silence, and maybe you've never heard it that way, but there's a way to live with a peaceful mind, even when everything around you seems confusing. There is a way to silence the chaos within without escaping reality. And this secret, it is not new. It has always been on record, waiting to be understood. If you stay until the end, something inside you will begin to change today. Not because you're going to learn something new, but because you will finally understand what has always been there. Proverbs 4:23. Above all things that are to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it are the sources of life. Now, as you continue with me, you will notice something different happening inside you. Each part of this path is built to show you, clearly and deeply, how God works directly in your mind, organizing thoughts, bringing direction, and restoring what seemed lost. You will learn to recognize what comes from God and what needs to be rejected, understand how to silence voices that confuse, and strengthen those that bring peace. And as we move forward, it won't just be a learning experience. It will be as if something begins to line up inside you, almost imperceptibly, but in a real way. And if that message has already started to touch you in any way, don't ignore it. There is a purpose even in the simple act of being here now. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this word to reach other people who are also in need of finding that same peace. Romans 12:2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There is a battle going on inside you that no one sees, but that defines everything you experience on the outside. And perhaps the biggest mistake is to think that life's biggest challenges are in the circumstances, the people, or the visible problems. They are not. The real battlefield is in your mind. It is there that decisions are formed, emotions are fed, and destinies begin to be drawn, long before any action happens. David understood this in a profound way. He faced lions, bears, giants, and armies, but nothing was as intense as the conflicts that arose within him. There were times when his mind was invaded by fear, when everything around him seemed threatening. There were days when guilt tried to silence his faith, making him feel distant from God. And in many moments, the persecution was not only outside, but also inside him, in the form of thoughts that insisted on saying that he would not be able to continue. But there is a powerful detail that changes everything. David did not accept any thought as truth. He did not surrender to what he felt at the first impulse. He did something that few learn. He talked to his own soul. He interrupted the negative flow and redirected his mind with intention, with awareness, and with faith. When his mind said, "It won't work," he responded. When sadness tried to dominate, he confronted it. He was not hostage to what he thought. He ruled what remained within him. And this is exactly where one of the deepest secrets that God wants to teach you lies. Not every thought deserves shelter. Not every inner voice deserves attention. There are thoughts that come only to weaken, confuse, and take you away from peace. And if you don't learn to identify them, you start believing them without realizing it. And when that happens, your life begins to reflect something God never planned for you. Keeping thoughts is not ignoring reality. It is choosing which truth will take up space within you. It is deciding consciously that what does not come from God will not remain. It is learning to replace fear with trust, anxiety with surrender, doubt with faith. And it doesn't happen automatically. It happens when you take spiritual control of your mind. There is a quiet strength in directing your thoughts to God, even when everything seems otherwise. It is at this moment that something begins to change inside, before any sign appears on the outside. And the more you practice this, the more you realize that peace does not depend on what happens around you, but on what you allow to grow within you. Psalm 42:5. Why art thou cast down, O my soul, and why art thou troubled within me? Hope in God. If this message touched something inside you, maybe it's not by chance. It may be just the moment when you needed to hear that. And if this made sense to your heart, write down Amen, because sometimes a simple decision already begins to change everything inside us. There is a detail that almost no one notices when they start trying to take care of their own thoughts. Not every voice that arises within you comes from God, even when it seems strong, urgent, or emotionally charged. In fact, many times, the more intense the voice, the greater the chance that it is not divine. And this is exactly where many are confused, because they expect God to speak loudly, with impact, with evident signs. But this is not always the case. There was a moment when all seemed too quiet for Elijah. After living extraordinary experiences, seeing miracles happen and feeling God's power intensely, he found himself in a place of emotional exhaustion. His mind was tired, overloaded, full of confused thoughts. And in that state, he expected God to manifest himself in the same way as before, in the fire, in the earthquake, in the strong wind. Something visible, unquestionable, impossible to ignore. But God chose a completely different path. It didn't come in the noise, it didn't come in the impact, it didn't come in what draws attention. It came in silence. It came in something so soft that it could easily be ignored by an agitated mind. A still, delicate, almost imperceptible voice, but absolutely clear to those who learn to discern. And this reveals a profound secret about how to store thoughts. The voice of God does not invade, does not confuse, does not generate despair. It brings peace even when it corrects. It directs, but does not pressure. It illuminates, but does not accuse. While many thoughts that arise within you come laden with anxiety, fear, and urgency, God's voice comes with a quiet steadfastness, which soothes within even before you fully understand it. The problem is that when the mind is too loud, that voice goes unnoticed. When you get used to paying attention to what is intense, to what screams loudest, you begin to ignore the very thing that could guide you safely. And without realizing it, he is led by thoughts that do not have a divine origin, but that seem convincing at the moment. Learning to discern is not about listening to something new, it is about silencing excess. It's about creating space within yourself to realize what has always been there, because God has never stopped speaking. But the mind is not always prepared to recognize it. And perhaps today you are exactly at that point, trying to understand what comes from God and what does not, trying to find clarity in the midst of so many inner voices. And the key is not to look for more signs, but to learn to perceive peace, because where there is constant confusion, God is not leading. But where there is a direction that, even silent, brings rest to the heart. There is something different there. 1 Kings 19:12, and after the fire, a still, small voice. If this word has awakened in you a sincere desire to hear God's voice more clearly, perhaps it is time to express it. Right here in the comments, "Speak, Lord, because I want to listen." And by leaving your like, you help that message reach others who are also trying to discern that voice in the midst of silence. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when a wrong thought is still small, but it already carries within it the potential to destroy everything. And the most dangerous thing is that, at this early stage, it does not scare. It seems justifiable, understandable, even acceptable. This is how it starts, not as a big mistake, but as an idea that you decide not to confront. Cain arrived at exactly that point. Nothing had happened yet in the outside world, but inside it, something was already forming. A discomfort, a comparison, a sense of rejection that began to grow. And instead of stopping, observing, and filtering what he was feeling, he allowed that thought to take root. He fed it, even if in silence. He gave space, and the most impressive thing is that God was not silent in the face of this. Before any attitude, before any consequence, God warned. This reveals something profound. The problem never begins in action. It begins in thought that has not been interrupted. God showed Cain that it could still be mastered, that he still had a choice, that impulse didn't need to become a reality. But there is a truth that needs to be faced. What you feed in thought, sooner or later, takes shape in your life. Unfiltered thoughts turn into uncontrolled emotions, and uncontrolled emotions drive decisions you didn't imagine making. And when that happens, many say, "I don't know what happened to me." But the truth is that it had been built for a long time inside the mind. To keep thoughts is not only to avoid evil, it is to prevent it from growing. It's noticing when something starts to move out of place, when a feeling starts to distort, when an idea starts to take you away from peace. Because not everything that seems small is harmless. There are thoughts that arrive as seeds, but that carry consequences that you will only understand later. And maybe today you're dealing with something like that. A recurring thought, an emotion that insists, something that you have ignored thinking it will go away on its own. But there is an invitation being made now, not to fight later, but to discern now, to stop before it grows, to dominate while it's still possible, because God continues to do the same as he did with Cain, warning before, calling before, showing before. He doesn't want you to live the consequences. He wants to teach you to guard what comes in, to protect what remains, and to choose what grows inside you. Genesis 4:7. Sin lies at the door, and his desire will be over you, but over him you must have dominion. And if, somehow, you feel that this word is calling you to pay more attention to what you have allowed inside your mind, maybe it's time to turn it into a simple but real decision. Right here in the comments, I choose to keep my thoughts. Sometimes, a small sentence can mark the beginning of a change that goes far beyond what you imagine. There is something that few people understand about the mind. It does not change only with effort, it changes with encounter. You can try to control thoughts, avoid certain ideas, even fight feelings, but as long as the root is not touched, everything keeps coming back. It's like trying to clean the surface without treating the source. And that's why so many people get tired, because they fight against that which has not yet been transformed from within. Paul lived exactly this reality, but in an extreme way. Before he had his mind renewed, he deeply believed that he was right. His thoughts were firm, convinced, full of certainty, but completely out of line with God's truth. This reveals something serious. Not every strong thought is a right thought. Sometimes the mind can be structured on something that feels true, but needs to be completely deconstructed. And then the meeting took place. It was not just a change in behavior, it was an internal rupture. What he thought, what he defended, what guided his decisions, everything was confronted at once. And from that moment on, God began a process that was not instantaneous but profound, the renewal of the mind. Renewing the mind is not forgetting who you were, it is allowing God to redefine who you are. It is replacing old patterns with a new way of thinking based on truth. It is learning to see oneself, life, and even difficulties in a completely different way. And this does not happen from the outside in, it happens from the inside out. God doesn't just correct thoughts, He reprograms how you think. It changes your perspective, adjusts your values, transforms your way of reacting. What once shook you begins to lose strength. What once dominated you begins to be controlled. And little by little, you realize that you no longer think as before. And because of this, he no longer lives as before. But there is an essential point in this process. Renewal needs to be continuous. It's not something that happens once and ends. It's a daily decision to align your thoughts with what God says, not what you feel at the moment, because feelings may fluctuate, but the truth remains. And maybe what you need today is not to try to control everything, but to allow God to begin that process within you. Not in a hurry, but with depth. Not with pressure, but with direction. Because when the mind begins to be renewed, the whole life begins to reorganize itself. Ephesians 4:23. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. If you're here so far, it's no accident. There is something being aligned within you, even if it is not yet entirely clear, and that's why you need to keep going. Because in the end, we're going to get into a time of prayer, and that prayer can be the beginning of a real transformation in your mind and heart. So it remains, because what is yet to come can touch exactly what you have not yet been able to change on your own. There is something that happens inside you all the time, even when you don't realize it. Thoughts are being planted. Some arrive lightly, almost unnoticed. Others enter with force, loaded with emotion. But all, without exception, carry a seed. And the big question is not just what you think, but what you allow to remain. Jesus revealed a profound principle that many hear, but few actually apply. He showed that the word is like a seed, but the soil is you. It's your mind, it's your interior. And that changes everything, because it takes the focus off the outside and puts the responsibility on what happens inside you. It's not just about what's said, it's about how it's received. And perhaps here is one of the most neglected points of the spiritual life. Many people want different results. They want peace, they want direction, they want clarity, but they continue to allow any kind of thought to come in and stay. It's like wanting fertile land, but not taking care of the soil. How to expect a good harvest while accepting any seed? There are thoughts that come and go, but there are others that find space. And when they find space, they begin to take root. At first, it is something small, almost imperceptible. A concern, a doubt, a negative memory, a word that was marked. But over time, this starts to grow. And when it grows up, it's no longer just a thought. It's a structure within you. And that's why keeping thoughts is not exaggeration, it's wisdom. It's not about living in fear of what comes to mind, but about having the discernment to choose what remains. Because what you keep, you cultivate. And what you cultivate will inevitably produce something. Jesus also showed that there are different types of soil. Some receive but do not sustain. Others even start well, but are suffocated by worries, distractions, excess of things occupying the internal space. And this reveals something important. It is not enough to receive something good. It is necessary to protect what has been received. Protecting the soil of the mind is learning to say no. Not for thoughts that drain, not for ideas that lead you away from peace, not for everything that seems harmless, but that gradually weakens your faith. And at the same time, it is learning to guard what edifies, what strengthens, what comes from God. And when that starts to happen, something changes quietly but powerfully. You begin to realize that your mind is no longer a messy place, but a fertile environment. A place where peace grows, where direction appears, where the presence of God becomes constant. Luke 8:15. The one who fell on good ground are those who, hearing the word, keep it in an honest and good heart. And if today you feel that you need to take better care of what you have allowed within you, maybe it is time to turn this into a simple but true decision. Right here in the comments, Lord, I keep your word. And leave your like, because this message can reach someone who also needs to start taking care of their own interior. There is a level of spiritual maturity that does not begin at the moment of pressure, but long before it, because when the pressure comes, it doesn't create who you are. She reveals. And this is exactly why so many people feel overwhelmed by negative thoughts when they are in difficult environments, surrounded by influences that pull them down, by words that discourage, by situations that seem to stifle faith. It's not just the environment, it's the absence of a firm, internal decision. Daniel lived in one of the most challenging environments possible. Everything around him was contrary to the principles he carried. The culture, the customs, the daily pressures, everything seemed to push him away from God. But there is a detail that completely changes this story. He did not wait for the moment of temptation to decide who it would be. He decided before. He set within himself a limit that would not be negotiated. And this reveals a powerful secret about guarding thoughts. It's not just reacting to what arrives, it's defining in advance what can come in. Because when you don't decide before, anything can influence you later. And the mind, when it is not protected, begins to absorb the surrounding environment without realizing it. How many times have you entered a place, heard certain conversations, seen certain situations, and without realizing it, did your mind start to fill up with that? Thoughts that were not there before begin to arise. Emotions that you didn't feel start to appear. And when you realize it, something inside you has already changed. Keeping your mind in such environments is not isolating yourself from the world. It is not allowing the world to settle inside you. It is being present, but aware. It's listening, but filtering. It is living, but protecting what God is building within you. Because the environment may be strong, but a decided mind is even stronger. Daniel had no control over where he was, but he was fully aware of what he would allow inside him. And this is a key that transforms everything. You may not be able to change everything around you, but you can decide what stays inside you. You can choose not to absorb what weakens, not to give space to what contaminates, not to feed what takes you away from peace. And when this decision is made in a true way, something begins to happen. Even in difficult environments, your mind remains stable. Even surrounded by negative influence, you don't let yourself be molded by it. There is an invisible protection, an inner firmness that sustains you from the inside out. Daniel 1:8. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. And if that word has found a place within you today, maybe it's because God is calling you to that level of decision. And if that made sense to your heart, this is one of those simple moments that can make a real impact. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You help this message reach others who are also struggling to protect their minds amid pressure. And in some way, you become part of something bigger, bringing that light to those who also need it. There is a silent secret that separates a confused mind from a directed mind, and it is not in the amount of thoughts you have, but in what you choose to repeat within yourself. Because in the end, it's not what goes through your mind that defines your life. It's what remains. It's what you revisit, what you feed, what you bring back every day, without even realizing it. Many people live stuck in mental cycles because they are constantly meditating on what does not edify. They relive problems, repeat concerns, reinforce fears, and without realizing it, they train their own minds to remain in that state. And here's a point that few see. Meditating is not something you choose to do or not. You're already doing it. The question is, in what? When God spoke to Joshua, he didn't give a military strategy. He didn't present a complex plan. He didn't bring something external. He went straight to the point that sustains everything, the mind. He showed that before any achievement happened on the outside, something needed to be established on the inside. A constancy, one focus, an invisible discipline that would keep Joshua aligned, even in the face of great challenges. Meditating in this context is not just reading or remembering. It is internalizing. It is to bring the truth into the mind continuously until it begins to shape your way of thinking, reacting, deciding. It's like a daily build-up, where every thought aligned with God strengthens an inner structure that sustains you, even when everything around you seems unstable. And perhaps here is one of the biggest keys to keeping thoughts. It is not enough to reject what is bad, it is necessary to replace it with what is right. Because an empty mind will always be filled, and when you intentionally choose to bring the word into your thoughts, something begins to reorganize. What used to generate anxiety begins to lose strength. What confused me begins to clear. And little by little, you realize that there is a direction coming from the inside out. Constancy is what transforms. It's not about intensity one day and absence the next. It's about continuity, about choosing every day to feed your mind with what comes from God, even when it doesn't seem necessary, even when everything seems to be fine. Because it is this constancy that prepares you for the moments when the mind will be most demanded. And when this practice becomes a part of you, something powerful happens. You no longer depend on circumstances for clarity. Your mind becomes a stable place, a place where God speaks, directs, and sustains. And it completely changes the way you live. Joshua 1:8. Meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. And as you listen to this, maybe someone has come to your mind right now, someone who needs this peace, this direction, this renewal. If this happened, don't ignore it. Write the name of that person here in the comments. Let's put these lives before God together, because there is something powerful when we unite faith and intention in the same purpose. There is a deeper level in the spiritual life that many people have not yet accessed, because they believe that holding thoughts is just observing, trying to ignore, or at most replace. But there is something beyond that. There is authority. And when you understand this, everything changes, because you stop being a spectator of your own mind and start to govern what happens inside it. Many live as if they were hostages of their own thoughts. A thought arises, and the person accepts it. Another appears, and she gets involved. When she realizes she is already emotionally affected, without understanding how she got there. And the problem is not in the number of thoughts, but in the absence of positioning in front of them. Because what is not confronted is established. The word reveals something extremely strong. You were not called to deal with thoughts. You were called to take them captive. This means that not every thought deserves analysis. Some need an immediate response. They need to be stopped, confronted, and brought into line with God's truth. This is spiritual warfare, and it happens in silence within the mind. There is a clear difference between a thought that comes to edify and one that comes to weaken. One brings peace, even when it corrects. The other brings confusion, heaviness, fear, and urgency. And when you learn to identify that, you also need to learn how to take action, because discernment without action does not transform anything. To take a thought captive is not to allow it to grow freely. It is noticing when something is not aligned and, at that very moment, interrupting. Not tomorrow, not the day after, on the spot. It's like closing a door before something unwanted gets in. It is to take an active, firm, conscious stance. And that takes practice. At first, it may seem difficult because many thoughts already come with force, already loaded with emotion. But the more you exercise that authority, the faster you realize. It becomes easier, and what once dominated you begins to lose space. You begin to understand that you don't have to accept everything you feel, that you don't have to agree with everything you think, that there is a greater truth that can govern your mind, even when your emotions tell you otherwise. And this brings a freedom that does not depend on circumstances, because in the end, to guard thoughts is not just to protect, it is to govern. It's deciding who has a voice within you. It is consciously choosing that only that which is aligned with God will have room to remain. And when that decision becomes constant, your mind ceases to be an uncontrolled battlefield and becomes a place of authority, direction, and peace. 2 Corinthians 10:5, bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. None of this is happening by chance. If you have come this far, it is because there is something being awakened within you. And what is yet to come can further deepen this transformation. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared that can mark a new beginning in the way you think, feel, and live before God. There is a type of thought that does not arrive with noise, but remains with weight. He doesn't scream, he doesn't press right away. But it settles in quietly and begins to shape the way you see everything. It is the wounded thought, the one that is born of an unresolved pain, of a memory that still bothers you, of a situation that has left deeper marks than you would like to admit. And the most delicate thing about all of this is that when the mind is wounded, it begins to interpret life through that pain. Simple situations take on another meaning. Words seem harsher than they really are, and even the silence of others can be interpreted as rejection. Gradually, without realizing it, the mind closes, protecting itself, but also limiting himself. Joseph experienced something that could have completely destroyed his mind. Betrayed by those he trusted, rejected without explanation, forgotten when he most needed to be remembered. Everything around him was reason enough to feed thoughts of revolt, injustice, bitterness. And humanly speaking, no one would blame him if he had become someone hardened inside. But there is a point that completely changes this story. Joseph did not deny the pain, but he also did not allow it to define his thoughts. He did something that few can. He reinterpreted everything in the light of God. Where there was betrayal, he saw purpose. Where there was injustice, he recognized direction. Where there was abandonment, he noticed preparation. That doesn't mean it was easy. It means that it was intentional. Because wounded thoughts don't heal on their own. They need to be confronted with a greater truth. They need to be exposed to God's light, where what seemed like just pain begins to take on a new meaning. And here's one of the most profound teachings about guarding thoughts. Forgiveness isn't just a spiritual act, it's a mental protection. When you don't forgive, the memory lives on, repeating itself, strengthening itself, occupying space within you. But when you decide to let go, something starts to break inside. Memory still exists, but it no longer dominates. The pain was still real, but it no longer controls. Keeping the mind is also that. It is not allowing what hurt you to continue to govern your thoughts. It is choosing, even if gradually, to look at it in a different way. Not because what happened was right, but because you decided not to carry the weight of it inside you anymore. And when this process begins, something surprising happens. What was once just pain begins to turn into wisdom. What seemed like an end begins to reveal a path, and you realize that God wastes nothing, not even that which tried to destroy you. Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God made it good, to do as it is this day, to keep a great people alive. There is a very delicate moment in the spiritual life when the person even wants to hear God, but he cannot distinguish whether it is really him speaking or whether it is only the mind itself producing answers. And this generates a silent confusion, because the more you try to understand, the more voices seem to arise within you. Different thoughts, opposite directions, mixed sensations. And in the midst of all this, a question begins to echo: how to know what really comes from God? Samuel went through exactly this process. He was in a spiritual environment, close to the place where God manifested himself, but he still did not know how to recognize the divine voice. This shows something profound. Being close does not mean knowing how to discern. Having faith does not automatically mean knowing how to listen. There is a learning process, an internal adjustment that needs to happen. When God first called Samuel, he completely confused. He thought it was someone else, and this was repeated more than once. Now think about it carefully. God was speaking, but Samuel's mind was not yet trained to identify. This means that God's voice may already be present in your life, but not yet recognized in the right way. And here's an essential point about guarding thoughts. Not all confusion comes from God's absence. It often comes from a lack of sensitivity to perceive how he speaks. Because God does not compete with the noise of the mind, he reveals himself in that which demands attention, stillness, and perception. Developing this sensitivity is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but starts with an internal posture, a willingness to listen more than talk, to perceive more than to react. It is learning to slow down our thoughts, not to get carried away by the first idea that arises, not to assume that everything that seems logical comes from God. Over time, something begins to change. You start noticing patterns. God's voice does not bring confusion, even when it challenges. It does not generate despair, even when it corrects. There is a different clarity, a peace that accompanies it, even if the answer is not yet complete. And the more you position yourself to listen, the more your mind adjusts. What was once confusing begins to align. What once seemed the same begins to differentiate. And you realize that it's not about hearing something new, it's about recognizing what has always been there. Keeping thoughts also goes through this. It is not just rejecting what is bad, but learning to value what comes from God, give space, attention, priority. Because when you recognize the right voice, you also learn to ignore the others. 1 Samuel 3:10, Speak, for your servant hears. And if this message has reached you today, perhaps it is because there is something being adjusted within you, a call to listen differently, more deeply. And if this touched your heart in any way, write here in the comments, I trust in God. Sometimes a simple expression of faith makes room for something new to start happening within you. There is a type of tiredness that does not come from the body, it comes from the mind. You may even be standing still, doing nothing physically, but inside, everything is accelerated. Thoughts pile up, responsibilities get mixed up, worries repeat themselves, and without realizing it, your mind begins to carry a weight that it was not made to bear. And the hardest thing is that many times this happens while you are trying to do the right thing, trying to handle everything, trying not to fail. Martha was exactly like that. On the outside, everything seemed correct. She was busy, serving, taking care of the details, trying to do her best. But inside, his mind was overloaded. It wasn't just what she did, it was how she thought while she was doing it. Each task was accompanied by pressure, each detail carried an internal charge. Each moment increased the feeling that something was out of place. And it is at this point that many identify, because anxiety rarely starts with big problems. It begins with disorganized thoughts, with a mind that tries to embrace everything at the same time, that can't prioritize, that can't rest, even when it should. It's a constant restlessness, a sense of urgency that never ends. When Jesus looked at Martha, he did not criticize her actions, he revealed the root. He showed that the problem was not in what she did, but in what was happening inside her. You are anxious and weary about many things. This reveals something profound. It is not the many things themselves that generate anxiety. It is the way they occupy the mind. Keeping thoughts also involves learning to simplify. It is understanding that not everything deserves the same level of attention, that not everything needs to take up space at the same time within you. It's learning to slow down on the inside, even when life keeps happening on the outside. Because there is a difference between living responsibly and living with mental overload. When the mind is misaligned, even the simple becomes heavy. But when there is internal order, even the difficult becomes bearable. And this order does not come from outside, it starts within, in the way you organize your thoughts. Perhaps today what has kept you from peace the most is not the problems themselves, but the way your mind is dealing with them. Accumulated thoughts, repeated worries, a constant attempt to control everything. And in the midst of this, the presence of God is being set aside, not for lack of desire, but for lack of space. And that's exactly what needs to change. Not to add more things, but to adjust what is already inside. Reduce excess, silence what is not necessary, focus on what really matters, because when the mind finds that place, the presence of God ceases to be something distant and becomes something accessible, simple, real. Luke 10:41-42. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and weary over many things, but only one thing is necessary. If you've made it this far, there's a reason. Maybe that's the word you needed to hear to start reorganizing what's inside you. Don't leave now, because what we are yet to see can bring exactly the clarity that your mind needs at this time. There is a very subtle, almost imperceptible moment when faith is still present, but it is no longer firm. It's not that you stopped believing, but something inside you started to oscillate. One thought comes in, then another, and when you realize it, there is no longer that clarity that sustained you. It's as if your mind is divided, pulled in two directions at once. Pedro lived exactly that moment. While his thoughts were aligned with Jesus, he did something that seemed impossible. He walked on the water. This reveals a powerful truth. When the mind is focused in the right direction, you can experience things that go beyond logic, beyond limitations, beyond what seems possible. But what made Peter sink was not the water, it was not the wind, it was not the storm. All of this was already there from the beginning. What changed was the focus of his mind. In an instant, he stopped looking at what supported his faith and began to pay attention to what fueled fear. And this small deviation was enough to destabilize everything. This is how it happens in the lives of many people. It is not a big wrong decision that causes the fall, but a sequence of misaligned thoughts. A moment of doubt that is not interrupted, a fear that is fed, an insecurity that gains space. And when those thoughts start piling up, the faith still exists. But he no longer governs. Keeping thoughts is also protecting focus. It's noticing when your mind starts to split, when part of you still trusts, but another part is already surrendering to fear. Because a split mind does not sustain steadfastness. It oscillates, it weakens, it loses stability. And maybe today you are exactly like that. He still believes, he still prays, he still seeks. but you feel that something inside you is not fully aligned, as if there was an internal struggle going on, one part wanting to move forward and the other hesitating. And that is tiring. This wears you out, because to live with a divided mind is to live without peace. But there is a way back, and it starts in the same place where everything was lost, the focus. It's not about trying to control everything around, but about intentionally choosing where your mind will remain. It is deciding that even with the wind, even with the difficulties, you will not deviate from what sustains your faith. Because the moment Peter began to sink, Jesus was not far away. He was there, ready to sustain again. This shows that even when the mind is destabilized, there is still access, there is still restoration, there is still direction. Matthew 14:30-31. O of little faith, why did you doubt? And if somehow you feel that God has already done things in your life, even in the midst of your doubts, maybe it's time to recognize it. Right here in the comments, amen. Sometimes a simple word is enough to realign your heart and remind your mind of all that God has done for you. There is a place where thoughts are not only controlled, they are transformed. A place where the mind stops fighting alone and begins to be shaped by something greater. And this place is not physical. It does not depend on circumstances. It is not limited to time. That place is the presence of God, because there are changes that do not happen by effort, but by exposure. The closer you get, the more you are transformed. Moses experienced this in a way that goes beyond words. He climbed the mountain carrying responsibilities, doubts, emotional weight, difficult decisions. But when he descended, something about him was no longer the same. And the most impressive thing is that it was not only internal. The transformation was visible. His face reflected what he had lived in secret. This reveals a powerful principle. What you experience in God's presence inevitably manifests itself in your life. But before this external transformation, something happened within him. His mind was adjusted. Thoughts that once carried weight began to be reorganized. The way of seeing has changed. The way of understanding what was happening around him was no longer the same. Because when you come into the presence of God for real, you don't leave with the same thoughts. And perhaps this is the point that many still do not understand. It's not just about asking, talking, or seeking quick answers. It is about remaining. Because it is in permanence that the mind slows down, that thoughts align, that what was confused begins to make sense. It is in this environment that God works in silence, adjusting what no one sees. Keeping thoughts also goes through this. It is not just rejecting what is bad, but exposing yourself to what transforms. Because the more you fill yourself with God's presence, the less room you have left for what destabilizes you. The mind begins to find a new pattern, a new reference, a new basis. And the most interesting thing is that this transformation does not need to be forced. It happens naturally when you choose to be in that place, when you decide to stop, even for a few minutes, and stand before God with sincerity. No rush, no distraction, no trying to control everything, just to be. And little by little, what seemed heavy begins to become lighter. What seemed confusing begins to clear. What seemed distant begins to become close. Not because everything has changed on the outside, but because something has been adjusted inside you. Exodus 34:29. The skin of his face shone because he had spoken with God. And perhaps what you need today is not more answers, but more presence. Because it is in this place that your mind finds what it cannot produce on its own. And if you've come this far, it's because there's something being prepared for you to understand even more deeply. Stay. Because what is yet to come may open your eyes in a way you never realized before. There is a type of thinking that seems strong, intelligent, and even admirable, but that deep down is completely disconnected from God. It's not weak thinking, it's not confusing, it's not disorganized. On the contrary, it is structured, collective, convincing. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous, because not everything that seems right to human eyes is aligned with the sky. The Tower of Babel did not start with bricks, it started with ideas. It was all born into people's minds, a desire to grow, to achieve, to build something great. And so far, nothing seems wrong. But the problem was not in the construction, it was in the motivation. It was a hive mind driven by self-sufficiency, a thought that said, even if in silence, we don't need God. And this is one of the most subtle dangers when it comes to storing thoughts. Mistakes do not always come in the form of weakness. Sometimes it comes in the form of exaggerated confidence, independence, a sense of absolute control. That's when the mind starts to rely only on its own logic, on its own plans, on its own certainties. And little by little, God ceases to be the center. The most impressive thing is that everyone was united. There was agreement, there was alignment, there was progress. But all of this was being built on a wrong foundation. This reveals something profound. Just because a thought is shared by many does not mean it is correct. It is not because it seems to work that it is approved by God. To guard thoughts is also to watch the intention behind them. It is noticing when something begins to be born within you based only on pride, the need to prove something, the search for recognition or control. Because these thoughts, even if they seem productive, carry a silent departure from dependence on God. And there is a point at which these thoughts cease to be just internal and begin to transform into life direction. Decisions are made, paths are chosen, attitudes are formed, all based on a mind that little by little disconnected from the true source. The big question is not just what you're thinking, but where it's coming from. Is it born of a trust in God or an attempt to replace Him? Is it aligned with His will or just your own will? Because when the mind is filled with itself, it loses the ability to listen. And that's exactly what happened. What seemed like progress became an interruption. What seemed like growth turned into confusion, because everything that is built out of alignment with God can even go up for a while, but it does not hold up. Genesis 11:6. Behold, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they are starting to do. There is a silent difference between a mind that oscillates and a mind that remains. It's not about not having problems. It's not about living without challenges, but about not being carried away by every thought that arises. Because an unstable mind reacts to everything, but a steady mind chooses where to remain. And it is exactly this choice that defines the level of peace that a person experiences. Many believe that peace comes when everything is resolved, when situations calm down, when there is no more reason to worry. But the truth is that if peace depended on it, no one would live in peace for long, because there's always going to be something going on. There's always going to be something trying to occupy the mind. The point is not the absence of problems, it is the direction of thoughts. Isaiah reveals a secret that completely changes this perspective. Peace is not the result of what is outside, it is a consequence of where the mind is fixed. This means that two people may be living the same situation, but experiencing completely different realities. One is dominated by restlessness, while the other remains at rest. Not because the situation has changed, but because the mind is positioned differently. And here's the deepest point. A steady mind is not a perfect mind, it's a resolute mind, determined to return whenever necessary. Determined not to get lost in the excess of thoughts. Determined not to give space to everything that tries to steal peace, because thoughts will keep coming up, but not all of them need to be followed. To keep thoughts at this level is not just to reject or replace, it is to maintain constancy. It is to create an internal habit of returning to God even when the mind tries to disperse. It's like someone who, when they realize they've been distracted, just comes back, without guilt, without weight, but firmly. And the more this is practiced, the more natural it becomes. Over time, something begins to stabilize within you. That need to react to everything decreases. That mental urgency loses strength. And in its place comes a calm that does not depend on circumstances. A peace that needs no explanation because it does not come from outside. And perhaps what is missing today is not more effort, but more direction. Don't try to control everything, but choose better where your mind remains. Because it is in this place that God sustains, guards, and strengthens. Isaiah 26:3, You will keep in peace the one whose mind is set on you, for he trusteth in thee. And if this message reached you, it was not by chance. There are many people now living exactly what you have already begun to understand here. By liking this video, subscribing and activating notifications, you help this word to reach those who also need to find that peace that does not depend on circumstances, but is born from a mind grounded in God. There is a silent way of moving away from God that does not begin with attitudes, but with thoughts. Before any external decision, something has already changed inside. Resistance appears, a justification begins to form. A subtle idea arises saying that perhaps there is another way, easier, more comfortable, less demanding. And without realizing it, the mind begins to move away before the body even moves. Jonas lived exactly this process. God gave a clear direction, but before any action, something happened within him. He did not agree. He did not accept. And this internal disagreement made room for thoughts that began to build an alternative route. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was something that formed little by little inside the mind. And this reveals an extremely important point. Flight never begins in the feet. It begins in the thoughts. When the mind begins to reject what God is directing, it tries to find ways that seem easier to accept, and these paths often seem logical, justifiable, even coherent, but they carry a silent departure from purpose. To hold away thoughts is also to notice when something inside you begins to resist what is right. When a desire arises to postpone, to ignore, to do it differently. Because the mind will not always reject it clearly. Sometimes it just tries to negotiate. And it is at this point that many get lost, because they begin to make room for ideas that little by little take them away from God's direction. But there is something powerful about God. He does not ignore this process. He intervenes, not to punish, but to align, not to push away, but to bring back. And often, this intervention begins right where it all began, in the mind. Jonas had to reach a point of internal exhaustion to realize this. It was not only a difficult external situation, it was a moment when his thoughts could no longer sustain the escape. Everything that seemed to make sense began to crumble inside. And at that moment, something changed. He remembered God. This shows that even when the mind wanders, there is still a path back. There is still a memory that can be activated, a consciousness that can awaken, a truth that can be taken up. Because God doesn't abandon you in your wrong thoughts. He works to bring you back from them. And maybe today there is something inside you that is trying to escape. Not necessarily in a visible way, but in thoughts that avoid, that postpone, that divert. And at the same time, there's a quiet voice trying to bring you back, trying to realign, trying to adjust what has started to slip out of place. To keep thoughts is also to allow God to interrupt what is not right. It is not to insist on paths that were born of internal resistance. It is to recognize, at the right time, that there is still time to go back, to adjust, to start over. Jonah 2:7. When my soul failed within me, I remembered the Lord. There is a way of worshipping God that does not make noise, does not appear to anyone, and does not depend on words. It happens in the silence of the mind, in the care of what you choose to keep inside yourself. Because not all worship is sung, some are thought out, and it is precisely these that reveal the deepest level of intimacy with God. We live in a time where everything is fast, where thoughts pass without being noticed, where almost no one stops to truly reflect. But there is a spiritual secret hidden in what you choose to preserve. It's not just about what you think, but about what you choose to keep alive within you. Because what you keep carefully, you honor. Maria understood this in a rare way. She not only lived extraordinary moments, she knew what to do with them inside herself. While many would see, hear, and move on, she stopped. She reflected. She revisited. She didn't let what God was doing go unnoticed. She kept it. And here there is a principle that completely transforms the way we deal with thoughts. Not everything should just be lived. Some things need to be contemplated. Because when you contemplate, you go deeper. When you save, you strengthen. When you revisit with intention, it begins to take root within you. To hold holy thoughts is to create an internal environment where God is constantly reminded. It is to bring back what He has already done, what He has already said, what you have already felt. It is not allowing these experiences to get lost in the middle of the routine, but giving them a place within you. And that changes everything, because a mind that learns to guard what is God's begins to become a place of peace. Not because there are no other thoughts trying to enter, but because there is something stronger already established inside. There is a presence that has been cultivated with attention. Perhaps what is missing today is not more experiences with God, but more care for what you have already received, because many times God speaks, God shows, God touches, but the mind does not keep. And what is not kept is lost over time. Keeping thoughts is also that. It is to treat what comes from God as something precious. It's not letting it mix with the rest. It is to separate, protect, value. Because when you do that, your mind stops being just a place of passage and becomes a place of permanence. And the more you practice this, the more sensitive you become, more attentive, more aware, more connected. Because you start to realize that God doesn't just speak in big moments, but also in the details, and that each of them can be kept. Luke 2:19. Mary kept all these things, checking them into her heart. And if this word made you realize how important it is to keep what comes from God, maybe it's time to state it simply but truthfully. Right here in the comments, God takes care of me. Sometimes a small sentence is enough to keep a truth alive within the heart. There is an invisible point where the miracle begins, and it is not in the hands, it is not in the steps, it is not in what people see. It starts in the mind. Before any movement, before any attitude, something needs to happen inside you. A thought needs to be born, grow, and take hold. Because without that, even the opportunity passes, and nothing happens. That woman carried years of pain, frustration, attempts that didn't work. Humanly, everything inside her could have surrendered to fatigue, to giving up, to the idea that nothing else would change. And that's exactly how many thoughts start to form when time passes and the answer doesn't come. An inner voice begins to say that there is no point in trying anymore, that it has gone too far, that it is too late now. But something different happened inside her. In the midst of so many possibilities of negative thoughts, a specific thought emerged, and she decided to believe him. If I just touch, I'll be healed. Notice this carefully. The miracle had not yet happened, but faith was already alive within her. Before the touch, before the movement, before the demonstration, there was already a certainty being built in the mind. And here is one of the most profound teachings about storing thoughts. Faith doesn't start when you see it. It starts when you decide what you're going to believe internally. It's a quiet but powerful placement. It is choosing to nurture a thought that is aligned with God, even when everything around seems to say otherwise. Many expect to feel something different and then believe. They expect to see signs, external changes, clear answers. But the spiritual path works in reverse. First you hold the right thought. First you hold that within you. First you allow that truth to grow within. And only then does this begin to manifest itself. This woman didn't just have a thought. She protected that thought. In the midst of the crowd, in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of everything that could distract or discourage her, she kept it alive inside her. He did not let other voices replace. He did not allow doubts to take the place. She kept it. And that changes everything, because thoughts aligned with God, when they are held firmly, begin to generate movement. Not an impulsive movement, but a directed one. Not a desperate action, but an attitude full of faith. And when that happens, something opens, something responds, something manifests. Perhaps what is missing today is no longer strength, but a different thought being cultivated. Something you have not yet allowed to grow within you. Because as long as certain thoughts take up space, others will not have the opportunity to establish themselves. Mark 5:28. For he said, "If I will only touch his garments, I will be healed." What you will hear next can completely change the way you see what you are experiencing now. There is something that few realize in time, but that can make all the difference in what you are expecting from God. Stay, because the next step in this journey may be exactly the answer you haven't been able to find yet. There is a kind of leading from God that is not accompanied by explanations, only by conviction. And this completely challenges the way the human mind usually works, because we are used to understanding first and then acting. We want clarity, details, guarantees. We want to feel safe before taking any step. But on the spiritual path, the opposite often happens. God speaks simply, silently, and waits for an answer before everything even makes sense. Abraham lived exactly this type of calling. There was no map, there was no detailed plan, there was no visible confirmation of what was to come. There was only one direction. And in view of this, his thoughts needed to go through a deep alignment. Because obeying without understanding requires more than courage. It requires internal trust. And here's one of the hardest points when it comes to holding thoughts. The mind tries to fill in what it doesn't understand. It creates scenarios, raises doubts, seeks explanations that will not always come at that moment. And if you don't learn to deal with it, you end up blocking what God is trying to lead, because you expect answers that are not yet part of the process. Keeping thoughts is also knowing how to deal with God's silence. Not a silence of absence, but a silence of direction, where he has already spoken enough for the next step, but not all about the whole way. And in this space, the mind needs to learn to rest, even without fully understanding it. Abraham had to choose between trusting logic or trusting the voice he recognized as divine, and this choice happened within him before any external step. Because all true obedience begins in the mind. It is there that the decision is formed, that doubt is confronted, that faith is established. And maybe today you are experiencing something similar, a feeling that God is directing you, but without many details. An internal discomfort that doesn't let you stay as before, but also doesn't fully explain what's ahead. And this can generate insecurity because the mind wants answers, it wants control, it wants predictability. But there is a key to this process: trust before understanding. Not as an impulsive act, but as a spiritual positioning. It is choosing to believe that, even without understanding everything, God already sees the complete path. It is to allow your thoughts not to be dominated by the need for explanation, but sustained by the certainty of the one who is leading. Because when the mind learns to trust, something changes profoundly. Anxiety decreases, the pressure for answers weakens, and a different peace arises, not based on understanding, but on trust. And this peace sustains steps that would otherwise never be taken. Hebrews 11:8. By faith Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. There is a kind of thought that is born when the soul feels forgotten. It is not something that appears aggressively, but is formed little by little, as a constant feeling that no one is seeing, no one is noticing, no one is caring. It is the thought of abandonment, and when it sets in, it starts to distort everything. The way you see yourself changes, the way you interpret situations changes, and even your relationship with God can begin to be affected. Hagar arrived exactly at this place, alone, wounded, rejected, without direction. The surrounding desert reflected the desert within her, and it's important to understand this. The desert wasn't just physical, it was mental. His thoughts were loaded with pain, rejection, invisibility. Everything inside her pointed to the idea that she had been left behind, that her story didn't matter anymore. And it is at this point that something extraordinary happens. God does not appear first by changing the situation. It appears changing perception. Before any exit, before any external response, he reveals himself in a specific way, as the one who sees. This is not just a detail, this is a deep restoration of the mind, because when someone feels invisible, the greatest miracle is not to leave the place where they are. It is to realize that you have never been alone. It is to understand that even in silence, even in pain, even when no one else saw, God was present all the time. And this recognition begins to heal thoughts that were distorted. Keeping thoughts also goes through this. It is not allowing moments of pain to define your identity. It is not accepting as truth what rejection tries to implant within you. Because situations can even hurt you, but they don't have the authority to define who you are. When Hagar had this encounter, something changed inside her. The scenario was still the same, but the way of thinking was no longer the same. That sense of abandonment began to fade, because now there was a greater truth occupying space. God sees. And when that truth comes in, it begins to restore dignity, value, identity. Perhaps today there are thoughts inside you that were born in difficult moments. Ideas that were formed when you felt alone, when you weren't understood, when something didn't go as expected. And these thoughts may have remained even after the situation has passed. But there is an invitation being made now to allow God to touch exactly these places, not ignoring the pain, but transforming the way you see it all. Because when you understand that God sees, you begin to realize that your story has never been out of his control. Genesis 16:13. You are God who sees me. For he said, have I not also looked upon him who sees me? And if while you were listening to this something came to your heart, maybe it's time to put it before God. If you want, write here in the comments your prayer request. What is inside you? What needs care, direction or response? Because when we place before God what we carry inside, something begins to be transformed, even if still in silence. There is a critical moment in the spiritual life when it is not a lack of faith that threatens you, but distraction, because the attack does not always come to destroy directly. Sometimes it comes to divert. It tries to take away your focus, fragment your attention, weaken your constancy. And when the mind loses focus, even what was being built firmly begins to become vulnerable. Nehemiah understood this in a profound way. As he rebuilt something important, voices began to emerge around him. Invitations, criticisms, provocations, attempts to interrupt what he was doing. And humanly speaking, many of these voices seemed relevant. They seemed to demand attention. They seemed to deserve a response. But he realized something that few realize. Not everything that catches his attention deserves his attention. And here's one of the most powerful secrets about storing thoughts. It's not just about rejecting what's clearly wrong, but also about not engaging with what seems important but isn't part of the purpose. Because there are distractions that don't come as an error, they come as an interruption. How many times has your mind been pulled to things that deep down had no real value? Thoughts that started small, but that stole your time, your energy, your peace, and when you realized you were already far from what really mattered. Nehemiah made a very clear internal decision. He didn't come down. This was not just an external response, it was a mental position. He chose not to allow those voices to take up space within him. He didn't trade his attention. He didn't make room for distractions that could weaken his mission. Keeping thoughts is also that. It's protecting your focus as something precious. It is to understand that your mind cannot be available for everything. Because every thought you accept consumes energy, takes up space, and influences your direction. And if you don't filter this, you end up wasting strength on what doesn't take you forward. There is a spiritual maturity in knowing how to ignore, in not responding to everything, in not reacting to everything, in not giving space to everything. Because when you try to deal with all the voices, you lose the clarity of the voice that really matters. And perhaps the biggest challenge today is not something big, but small distractions that are taking you off track. Thoughts that seem harmless, but that are fragmenting your attention. Ideas that arise and take you away, even if slowly, from what God is building inside you. But when you decide to protect your mind, something changes. The focus is strengthened, the direction is maintained, and what once seemed difficult begins to flow more clearly. Because a protected mind is not easily lost. Nehemiah 6:3. I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. There is a moment when God begins to stir something deeper than the circumstances. It starts to mess with how you perceive reality. It is as if, suddenly, what once seemed common no longer satisfies. What was once enough no longer fulfills. A restlessness arises, not from anxiety, but from awakening, as if something within you is being called to a higher level of spiritual awareness. And this is a point that many do not understand. Not all restlessness is negative. Some are signs that God is trying to take you out of an automatic state, out of a superficial spiritual life, out of thoughts that have already settled. It is a wake-up call, not only to do more, but to see differently. Joel announced exactly that kind of time, a time when God would not only speak outwardly, but would pour out his Spirit in ways that would directly affect the mind, thoughts, perception. People would begin to see, to discern, to understand in a way that they could not before. Not because they learned something new, but because they were awakened from within. And this completely changes the way we store thoughts, because when the mind is spiritually asleep, it accepts anything. Any idea enters, any distraction takes up space, any concern dominates. But when there is an awakening, something changes. You begin to notice what previously went unnoticed. You begin to feel when a thought is not aligned. He begins to discern what edifies and what weakens. It is as if a light is lit within you, and what once seemed normal no longer seems normal. Certain conversations begin to bother you, certain environments no longer make sense, certain thoughts no longer find space, not because you're trying to avoid it, but because something inside you has changed, and maybe it's already happening to you. A feeling that something needs to be different, that you can no longer continue at the same level, that there is something deeper that you have not yet accessed, and this feeling did not come by chance. It is a calling. To keep thoughts at this level is to respond to this call. It is not ignoring this awakening. It is allowing God to refine your way of thinking, adjust your perception, elevate your spiritual awareness. Because the more you respond, the clearer everything becomes. And the clearer it becomes, the less room is left for what once dominated your mind. Because an awakened mind no longer accepts to live on automatic. She seeks, she discerns, she takes a stand. Joel 2:28. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. And if while you were listening to this something inside you woke up, don't ignore it. Perhaps this is exactly the moment God has chosen to call you to a new level. If you really felt it right here in the comments, God chose me. Because recognizing this can be the first step to living something you've never experienced before. There is a moment when everything changes. Not because the environment has changed, not because circumstances have become easier, but because something inside you has been touched in a real way. And when that happens, it doesn't take effort to look different, because transformation starts from the inside out. It is natural. It is visible. It is inevitable. Zacchaeus carried a mental structure built over time. His thoughts were aligned with self-interest, with personal gains, with a way of living that revolved around himself. And, without realizing it, this shaped their decisions, their attitudes, their way of seeing people, because it all starts in the mind. Before any action, there is an internal pattern that drives everything. But when he had a true encounter with Jesus, something immediately happened inside him. It wasn't a slow process at that time. It was an internal rupture. What once seemed normal no longer made sense. What was once justifiable began to bother us. And suddenly, his thoughts began to point in a completely different direction. This reveals one of the deepest secrets about holding thoughts. When the mind is touched by the presence of Christ, it can no longer remain the same. There is a change in priority, a change in perception, a change in value, and this is naturally reflected in attitudes. Zacchaeus didn't need someone to tell him to act differently. The change did not come from outside, it came from within. His thoughts began to reflect justice, reparation, generosity, and this shows that when the mind is restored, the behavior follows. Because what you constantly think, you end up living. Keeping thoughts is also allowing this type of transformation to happen. It is not resisting when God begins to mess with internal areas, because a lot of times He doesn't start by changing what you do, He starts by adjusting what you think. And when this happens, the external changes become only a consequence. Maybe you're trying to change attitudes, trying to correct behaviors, trying to live differently, but without realizing that the root is in the way you have been thinking. And as long as this is not touched, everything becomes more difficult. But when the mind is reached, everything starts to flow more naturally. And there is something very strong in this. True transformation generates testimony. Not because you want to prove something, but because people start to notice. They see a difference, they feel a change, they recognize something new. And this does not come from effort, it comes from a real encounter. Luke 19:8. Behold, I give to the poor half of my possessions, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Maybe you've been waiting for a change for a long time, trying to figure out where to start. And that word might be just the starting point you needed. Stay until the end, because what is yet to come can touch exactly what you have not yet been able to transform within you. There is something that many people overlook when trying to take care of their own mind. No one was created to sustain everything alone. There is a limit to what you can carry internally without help, without exchange, without connection. And when this limit is crossed, thoughts begin to weaken, faith begins to waver, and the mind becomes more vulnerable. The spiritual life was not designed to be isolated, because when you walk alone for too long, your own thoughts start to become the only reference. And this is dangerous, because, without realizing it, you can start to believe in distorted ideas, in feelings that are not true, in perceptions that have been shaped by difficult moments. The early church lived in a completely different way. They shared life, not only spiritual moments, but thoughts, experiences, difficulties, learning. There was a constant exchange, and this created something powerful, a collective protection of the mind. When one was weak, the other strengthened. When one began to get lost in confused thoughts, there was someone to bring clarity. When the faith of one wavered, the faith of the other sustained. This shows that thoughts strengthened in fellowship are much more resilient than isolated thoughts. Guarding your thoughts also involves choosing well who you walk with, because the conversations you listen to, the people you connect with, the environments you frequent, all of this directly influences what you think, and often more than you might think. There is a quiet strength when you are around people who are also seeking God. It's not just about words, it's about atmosphere. It's about being in an environment where your mind is constantly reminded of what's true, what's pure, what's edifying, and it strengthens you from the inside out. On the other hand, when you move away from this type of connection, your mind starts to become more exposed. Negative thoughts gain more space, doubts grow more easily, and what you would have overcome clearly before begins to become more difficult. And maybe today you don't just need to adjust what you think, but also the environment where those thoughts are being formed. Because a healthy mind is not only built individually, it is also strengthened in communion. Acts 2:46. And as they continued with one accord daily in the temple and broke bread at home, they ate together with joy and singleness of heart. And if this message has reached you, perhaps it is a reminder that you do not have to walk alone. And if you want to continue receiving words like this, which strengthen your mind and your faith, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and leave your like. Because together, we can continue to build an environment where thoughts are stored, strengthened, and aligned with God. There is a truth that can completely change the way you see your own mind. Not all the thoughts you carry today were born with you. Many have been formed along the way, influenced by experiences, words, frustrations, expectations. But there is something deeper than all this. There is an original thought of God about you, something that was established before you even existed. Jeremiah reveals this reality in an impactful way. Before any story, before any mistake, before any doubt, God had already defined a purpose. This means that before you started thinking about yourself, God had already thought about you. And these thoughts were not confusing, they were not insecure, they were not limited. They were clear, directed, and full of meaning. And here's one of the biggest internal conflicts many people face: living with thoughts that aren't aligned with what God has already established, because throughout life, the mind is filled with ideas that do not always reflect the truth. Thoughts of incapacity, doubt, devaluation. All of this takes up space, often without being questioned. Guarding thoughts also involves this level of discernment. It is not only filtering what arrives now, but also reviewing what is already inside. It is looking inside yourself and asking, is what I think about myself aligned with what God thinks? Because if it isn't, it needs to be adjusted. God not only knows your purpose, He also desires to align your mind with it. But this requires an internal decision. It requires you to be willing to let go of old thoughts, limiting beliefs, ideas that were built out of the truth. Because as long as the mind is full of wrong concepts, it is difficult to live what has already been prepared. And maybe what's holding you back today isn't a lack of capacity, but an excess of misaligned thoughts. Ideas that were accepted without realizing it, that were becoming part of the way you see yourself. But there is an invitation being made now to go back to the origin, to return to what God has already defined, first of all. When this begins to happen, something changes profoundly. The way you see yourself transforms, the way you make decisions adjusts, the way you react to situations gains a new foundation, because now it's no longer based on what you think, but on what God has already declared. And this change starts in the mind. It starts when you decide to align your thoughts with what is eternal and not with what has been built over time. Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you. There is a moment when everything around seems to lose control. And at the same time, something inside you starts to collapse. It's not just the external situation that scares you. It's the way your mind reacts to it. Thoughts accelerate, negative scenarios arise, fear begins to take up space, and when you realize it, chaos is no longer just outside. He's in. The disciples lived just that. The storm wasn't just strong, it was enough to completely destabilize their minds. Fear took over, human logic took over, and thoughts began to revolve around the worst-case scenario. And that's how it often happens. The situation may even be real, but despair is born in the way the mind interprets it. And in the middle of this scenario, something seemingly strange happens. Jesus was present all the time, but still they were gripped by fear. This reveals something profound. It is not just the presence of God around you that changes everything. It is the awareness of that presence within you. When Jesus gets up, he doesn't speak first to the disciples. He speaks to chaos. Shut up, be still. And at that moment, everything is reorganized. The wind ceases, the sea calms down, and what seemed uncontrollable becomes completely stable. But there is something even deeper in this. The same power that calmed the exterior was also available to rearrange the interior. Keeping thoughts is also learning to bring that presence into your mind, because there are times when you won't be able to stop the storm around you, but you can stop it from dominating your thoughts. You can choose not to feed despair, not to amplify fear, not to let the mind build something greater than reality. And this does not happen by force. It happens by consciousness. When you recognize that Jesus is present, something changes in the way you think. The urgency decreases, the fear loses strength, and the mind begins to slow down. Not because everything was resolved immediately, but because there is a trust that begins to take up space. Maybe today there is a storm going on in your life. Something that is trying to disorganize your thoughts, take away your peace, make you believe that there is no way out, but there is a voice that can still be heard in the midst of it all. A voice that does not scream, but that has enough authority to silence everything that is out of order. And when that voice finds space within you, the chaos begins to lose strength. The mind reorganizes, thoughts align, and what seemed impossible to control begins to calm down. Mark 4:39. Be still, be still. And the wind was still, and there was a great calm. Few people can perceive this level of depth, but if you have made it this far, there is something being revealed directly to your heart. Don't get distracted now. What is yet to come may be exactly what will bring definitive order into your mind. There is a level of pain that does not only reach the heart, it reaches the mind. That's when thoughts start to fill up with questions that have no answer, when everything that made sense starts to seem confusing, when reality seems too heavy to process. And in this place, the biggest risk is not only suffering, it is to lose inner firmness. Job got to that very point. Everything around him fell apart. Deep losses, intense pain, silence where there was once clarity. And in the midst of it all, his mind was pressed in every way. Thoughts of doubt arose. Questions began to appear. Voices around him tried to influence the way he interpreted all that. And it's important to understand this. Job's greatest battle wasn't just what he lost, but what he thought about what was going on. Because when the mind gets confused, everything intensifies. The pain seems greater, the hope seems smaller, and the feeling of abandonment begins to grow. But there is something that sets Job apart from all of this. He didn't deny the pain. He didn't pretend everything was fine. He didn't ignore what he felt, but he also did not allow his thoughts to turn away from God completely. Even in the midst of the confusion, he decided to maintain a point of firmness. This reveals a powerful principle about holding thoughts. Firmness is not the absence of struggle, it is decision in the midst of struggle. It's choosing not to disconnect, even when everything inside you tries to question. It is not allowing pain to define your vision, even when it seems to dominate everything around. Job had moments of internal conflict, had difficult thoughts, had deep questions, but in the midst of it all, he declared something that completely changes perspective. He knew, I didn't feel, I didn't see, I didn't fully understand, but he knew. And that certainty became an anchor for his mind. Keeping thoughts is also building this type of anchor, something that remains, even when everything fluctuates, something that sustains you, even when your emotions are shaken. Because there will be times when you won't be able to organize everything you're thinking, but you can still choose where to stay. Maybe today, your mind is being tested in some way. Confused thoughts, intense emotions, situations that seem difficult to understand. And in this scenario, the most important thing is not to have all the answers, but not to lose connection with what sustains you. Because when there is this firmness, even if small, even if silent, it prevents you from losing yourself completely. It keeps something alive inside you, even in the midst of pain. Job 19:25. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he will stand at the last on the earth. There is a point in life when everything seems too broken to be rebuilt. It's not just what's around, it is what begins to happen within the mind. Thoughts become heavy, repetitive, without direction. Hope begins to fade, not suddenly, but gradually, like a light that fades without you realizing exactly when it began. And the hardest thing about this kind of moment is not just what happened, it's what you start to think about what happened. Because the mind tries to interpret, tries to understand, tries to find meaning. But when she doesn't, she begins to draw dangerous conclusions. Ideas that there is no way out, that nothing will change, that what was lost can never be restored. It was precisely against this backdrop that one of the most powerful statements in the Bible emerged. In the midst of pain, destruction, and the completely opposite scenario, a decision was made. Not an external decision, but an internal one. A conscious choice to remember, even when everything seemed to say otherwise. This reveals a profound secret about storing thoughts. The mind needs to be directed intentionally, because if you don't decide what you're going to think about, pain decides for you. Circumstances take over, and little by little, you begin to believe things that do not reflect God's truth. But there is one key that changes everything: remembering. To bring back to mind what God has already done, what He has already demonstrated, what remains true regardless of the moment, because God's faithfulness does not change with circumstances. But your perception can change if you don't keep it. Renewing thoughts does not mean denying reality. It means not allowing reality to be the only voice within you. It is choosing, even in the midst of pain, to make room for a greater truth. It is deciding that even without seeing, there is still something that sustains. And when that choice is made, something starts to happen. Hope does not return explosively, but begins to emerge again, firmly and steadily, like a seed that finds room to grow, even in difficult terrain. Because in the end, hope is not a feeling that appears. It is a decision that stands. And the more you feed this decision, the more your mind begins to reorganize. What once seemed definitive is starting to lose strength. What seemed like the end begins to make room for something new. Lamentations 3:22-23. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed, for his mercies have no end, they are renewed every morning. And if that word found you at a difficult time, maybe it's just what your mind needed to start aligning again. If this made sense to your heart, write here in the comments, I trust in God's action. Because sometimes a simple statement is the first step to rekindling something that seemed to be going out inside you. There is a level of faith that does not depend on what the eyes see, but on what the mind has decided to believe. And this level is not common because it requires something that goes beyond feeling. It requires conviction, an internal certainty that does not fluctuate with circumstances, that does not wait for external confirmation, that does not need signs to sustain itself. The centurion understood this in a way that surprised even those around him. He was not inserted in the religious context. He had no spiritual history like many others, but within him there was a rare clarity. His thoughts were not divided between doubt and hope. They were aligned with a single truth. Jesus' authority was sufficient, and that changes everything, because many believe but at the same time question. They trust, but they still need to see. They wait, but they carry insecurity. And this mixture of thoughts prevents faith from establishing itself firmly. The mind becomes unstable, oscillating between possibilities, unable to position itself clearly. But the centurion did not work like that. He did not ask Jesus to come to his house. He did not demand closeness. He did not seek a physical experience. He understood that spiritual authority does not depend on physical presence, but on the word released. And this reveals one of the deepest secrets about storing thoughts. When the mind is aligned with the truth, it doesn't need constant confirmation. He might have doubted it. I could have thought that maybe it wouldn't work from a distance, that maybe something more concrete, more visible was needed. But he chose not to entertain this kind of thinking. He decided to trust completely. And this decision was made before any miracle happened. Keeping thoughts is also that. It is consciously choosing not to give room for doubt when the truth has already been revealed. It is not allowing the mind to negotiate possibilities contrary to what God has already established. Because when doubt finds space, it weakens the structure of faith. And perhaps today, what is missing is not more words, more signs, or more confirmations, but an internal position. A decision to align your thoughts with what God has already declared, regardless of what you have not yet seen. Because there is a powerful force when the mind is steady. When it stops oscillating, it stops constantly questioning and starts to rest in what is true. And in that place, something is released. Not because you did more, but because you finally took a stand. Matthew 8:8, Lord, I am not worthy that you should go under my roof, but speak only one word, and my servant will be healed. There is a type of thinking that is not entirely doubtful, but it is not yet firm faith either. It is a silent middle ground where the person wants to believe, feels that God is directing, but at the same time carries insecurities, questions, and a sense of inadequacy. And many condemn themselves for being in this place, as if God could only act when everything was already resolved within the mind. But there is something that needs to be understood. God does not only work with ready-made minds, he also works with minds in process. And this completely changes the way you see your own thoughts. Because sometimes you're waiting to be absolutely sure to move forward, while God is willing to walk with you in the midst of your doubts. Gideon was just like that. When God spoke to him, the answer was not immediate confidence. It was questioning. It was insecurity. It was a completely limited view of himself. He didn't see himself as someone capable. He didn't see himself as God was declaring. And this reveals something very common. Many times God says something about you that your mind cannot yet accept. But instead of rejecting Gideon, God began to work with him, with patience, with signs, with confirmations. Not to feed doubt, but to strengthen the faith that was still under construction. Because there is a difference between doubt that resists and doubt that seeks. And Gideon, even though he was unsure, kept coming back, kept asking, kept open. Keeping thoughts also involves this. It is not to close yourself when there are still questions, but also not to cling to insecurity as an identity. It is allowing God to adjust his mind in the process, bringing clarity little by little, strengthening what is still fragile. And there is a powerful detail in all this. God called Gideon valiant even before he saw himself that way. This shows that God's truth about you does not depend on how you feel at the moment. It is already established. The process is to get your mind to align with that truth. Maybe today you are exactly in that place, feeling that God is directing you, but at the same time dealing with thoughts that say you can't, that you're not ready, that you're not enough. And this can generate an internal conflict, a feeling of being divided. But God does not move away at this moment. He approaches. He confirms, he strengthens, he leads. Not in a hurry, but intentionally, because he doesn't just want you to get to your destination. He wants to transform your mind on the path. And as you allow this process, something starts to happen. Insecurity begins to lose strength, confidence begins to grow, and what seemed impossible begins to become accessible. Not because everything changed all at once, but because your mind began to align with what God has already declared. Judges 6:12. The Lord is with thee, O mighty man of valor. There is a moment when the battle seems too big, too complex, too impossible. And at that point, the mind begins to react even before any action. Thoughts multiply, negative scenarios form, and the feeling of inadequacy begins to take place. Because in the face of something that gets out of control, the human mind tries to take control. And that's exactly where the weight increases. Jehoshaphat was faced with something like this, a scenario that, humanly speaking, had no solution. A large army, a real threat, a situation that required an immediate response. And at that moment, everything could have been driven by fear, by human strategy, by trying to solve it with one's own strength. But something different happened inside him. Before any external movement, there was an internal alignment. He decided where his mind would remain. He chose not to feed despair, not to strengthen fear, not to build thoughts based on what his eyes were seeing. He did something that completely changes the outcome of any battle. He surrendered his thoughts. And this is deeper than it seems. Because surrendering thoughts is not giving up. It is recognizing limits. It is to understand that there are situations that will not be overcome by your strength, your logic, or your control. And when you try to sustain all of this alone, your mind becomes overwhelmed, wears out, and loses clarity. But when Jehoshaphat declared that the battle was not his, something changed immediately. Not in the external scenario, but within it. The pressure began to lift, the fear lost strength, and the mind found a place of rest that did not depend on the situation. And that's exactly what happens when you surrender your thoughts to God. Keeping your thoughts is also knowing when to stop mentally fighting against what you can't control. It's realizing when you're trying to solve everything inside your mind, creating strategies, imagining solutions, anticipating problems, and in the midst of that, moving away from trust. Because there are battles that are not won with mental effort, but with spiritual positioning. That's when you decide to trust, even without fully understanding it. This is when you choose not to feed the fear, even if it is trying to grow, It's when you refuse to allow your thoughts to be dominated by that which seems impossible. And when that decision is made, something powerful happens. The mind aligns, peace begins to emerge, and what seemed heavy begins to be sustained in another way. Not because you found the solution, but because you handed over control. 2 Chronicles 20:15. Do not be afraid or dismayed because of this great crowd, for the battle is not yours, but God's. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed. There is a detail that many ignore, but that can completely change the way you face what is in front of you right now. Stay, because this may be exactly the sign you've been waiting for. There is a moment when everything depends on an internal decision that no one sees. It is not a public action. It is not a visible attitude. It is a silent confrontation within the mind. It's when fear comes up with strong arguments, when insecurity tries to justify inertia, when everything seems easier if you do nothing. And it is exactly at this point that the destination begins to be defined. Esther arrived at this place. The situation was real, urgent, and dangerous. There were no guarantees. There was no security. There was no control over what could happen. Humanly, the most logical thing would be to protect yourself, avoid risks, remain silent. And this kind of thinking is starting to gain traction in a very convincing way. Because fear always tries to appear prudent, but something began to happen inside her. Before any external movement, there was an internal decision, an alignment of thought that changed everything. She realized that not acting was also a choice, and perhaps an even more dangerous choice. And at that moment, she understood that she needed to take a stand. This reveals a profound principle about holding thoughts. There are times when you need to decide which voice will prevail within you. Because fear speaks, doubt speaks, insecurity speaks, but there is also a voice that calls for something greater, for a purpose, for a responsibility that goes beyond comfort. Esther did not deny fear, but she did not allow it to rule her thoughts. She didn't wait to feel safe to act. She decided to take a stand, even though she felt the weight of the situation. And this decision was born within the mind, before any attitude. Keeping thoughts is also that. It is not allowing fear to dictate your choices. It's recognizing that certain thoughts will try to paralyze you, convince you to retreat, keep you in the place where everything seems safest. But that, many times, this place is far from the purpose. There is a powerful force when the mind aligns itself with what God is asking, even if it defies logic, even if it generates discomfort. Because at that moment, you stop being guided by what you feel and start being guided by what you know. And that's exactly what happened. When Esther made this decision, something changed, not just within it, but in the direction of everything around it, because internal decisions have external consequences. And when the mind positions itself, the path begins to open. Interceding is also born from this place. It's not just speaking words, it's taking a stance. It is to carry within oneself an awareness of purpose, a willingness to act, a surrender that begins in thought and manifests itself in attitude. Esther 4:16. If I perish, I perish. There is a type of wear and tear that does not come from an intense fight, but of the passage of time. That's when nothing seems to go wrong, but nothing happens as you expected either. The days go by, the answers don't arrive, and little by little the mind begins to be pressured by silent thoughts. Ideas such as, will it still happen? Did I get it wrong? Has the time passed? And without realizing it, the weight begins to affect what you believe. Simeon lived in this very place. He received a clear promise, something that came from God, something that left no doubt about his origin. But along with the promise came time. And time is one of the greatest tests for the mind, because it doesn't make noise, it doesn't warn, it just passes. And with that, you begin to put pressure on what is inside you. And here's the deeper point: the promise hasn't changed, but the mind could have changed. Simeon could have begun to question, he could have reinterpreted what he heard, he could have allowed time to weaken what was once so clear. But he did something that reveals a rare level of spiritual maturity. He kept the promise. Keeping thoughts is also that. It is to preserve what God has spoken, even when nothing around seems to confirm it. It is not allowing time to erase what has been ignited within you, because often it is not the lack of response that weakens faith. It is the way the mind deals with waiting. During this process, contrary thoughts may arise, doubts, questions, interpretations based on what is visible, and if these thoughts are not filtered, they begin to take up space. Gradually, what was a certainty becomes a possibility, and what was a promise begins to seem distant. But Simeon did not allow this process. He kept his mind aligned with what he had received, not because he saw signs every day, but because he decided to trust the origin of what was said. He did not feed contrary thoughts. He did not make room for doubt to grow. He remained. And this reveals a powerful key. Thoughts grounded in the promise resist the wear and tear of time. Not because time doesn't affect it, but because there is something stronger, sustaining inside. A conviction that does not depend on what is happening around us, but on what has already been established. Maybe today you are living in a time like this, where there is something that God has already placed in your heart, but that has not yet manifested itself. And in the middle of this, his mind begins to be tested. Thoughts come, trying to reinterpret, trying to weaken, trying to make you let go of what was once so right. But there is an invitation being made now to save, protect, stay. Do not allow time to steal what God has already declared, because when you keep your mind aligned, even in waiting, you create a space where the promise lives on. Luke 2:26. And it was revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die until he had seen the Lord's Christ. There is a level of battle that does not take place around you, but within your mind. And the most dangerous thing is that many times it does not feel like a war. It seems just a common thought, a logical idea, a seemingly harmless suggestion. But behind this, there is a subtle attempt to distort the truth and misalign you from God. This is exactly what happened in the desert. Jesus was not tempted with visible attacks, but with thoughts. Each proposal that came up was not totally absurd. She carried a mixture of truth and distortion, and this is what makes certain thoughts so dangerous. They do not arrive as a clear lie, they arrive as something that seems to make sense. If thou art the Son of God, notice this, the identity was not denied, it was questioned. And that's how a lot of thoughts start, not by saying that you are not capable, but by making you doubt, not by directly denying what God said, but by creating a gap for insecurity. And when this gap is accepted, it begins to grow. To keep one's thoughts is also to learn to recognize these distortions. Because not every wrong thought seems wrong at first glance. Some come with the appearance of logic, of necessity, of urgency. But deep down, they carry an intention to lead you away from what God has already established. Jesus answered in a way that reveals a deep secret. He did not argue with thought. He responded with the word. This shows that it is not your opinion that wins the battle, it is the truth. Because when you try to argue based on how you feel, you can get confused. But when you respond based on the word, you fall in line. Each time a distorted thought arose, he brought a clear truth. Not long, not complicated, but firm. And that completely interrupted that attempt. This reveals that the mind needs to be fueled. Because you can't respond with that which is not within you. Perhaps today many thoughts have arisen in your mind that seem true, but generating weight, doubt, confusion. And this happens because many times the mind is not prepared to respond. It absorbs, analyzes, gets involved, but it does not confront. But there's a key here. You can learn to respond. You can learn to identify when something does not come from God, and at that moment, bring the truth to occupy that space, not letting it grow, not allowing it to settle. Because when the word begins to occupy your mind, something changes. Thoughts lose strength, distortions are exposed, and clarity begins to return. Not because the thoughts have stopped coming, but because now you know what to do with them. Matthew 4:4. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. There is something very strong approaching now. If you keep going, you'll understand even more deeply how to keep your mind steady, even in the most difficult moments. Stay, because what comes next can mark a new level in your spiritual life. There is something that many do not realize about the mind. It does not keep itself renewed. Just as the body needs food every day, the mind also needs to be constantly fueled. Because if you don't feed your mind with what comes from God, it will naturally be filled with everything that comes from the world, worries, pressures, and distractions. And that's why, even after strong moments with God, many people feel confused, overwhelmed, or distant again. Not because they lost what they received, but because they did not keep what they started. Renewal is not an event. It is an ongoing process. It is a daily, silent, but extremely powerful practice. The psalmist reveals this level of understanding when he expresses a constant search. It wasn't something occasional. It wasn't just in times of need. It was a continuous thirst, an awareness that without this daily connection, the mind begins to misalign. And this completely changes the way of living. Keeping thoughts also requires constancy. It's not just filtering once, it's not just deciding in a moment. It's to sustain this decision every day, because new thoughts will arise, new pressures will appear, new situations will try to occupy space within you. And if there is no continual renewal, the mind begins to overwhelm again. There is a clear difference between someone who seeks occasionally and someone who maintains a constant practice. The first person depends on the circumstances. The second builds stability. Because when you create this habit of returning to God, of seeking, of aligning yourself, your mind begins to find a place of balance that does not oscillate easily. And this doesn't have to be complicated. It is not about quantity, but about constancy. It's about small moments, simple but repeated decisions. It's about choosing every day to direct your mind back to God, even if only for a short time, even if in a simple way. And the more it becomes part of your routine, the more natural it becomes. Your mind starts to recognize that place. It starts to desire that space. It starts to stabilize, and what once seemed difficult to control begins to organize itself more easily. Perhaps today what is missing is not more effort, but more constancy. Not big changes, but small, repeated decisions. Because that's what sustains an aligned, protected, and empowered mind. Psalm 63:1. O God, you are my God. I will seek you early in the morning. My soul thirsts for you. And if this word has come to you and made sense in a special way, perhaps it is time to acknowledge it with faith. If you feel that this is a new beginning for your mind and your spiritual life, write here in the comments, I believe, Lord. Because declaring this can be the first step to living this constancy every day. Everything you've heard so far points to a truth that can no longer be ignored. It's not enough to understand your thoughts. It is necessary to deliver them. Because while you try to control what happens inside your mind on your own, the weight continues. But when you decide to put everything before God, something begins to change in a profound and silent way. The mind only finds true rest when it ceases to be a field of control and becomes a place of surrender. And perhaps this is the most important moment of this entire journey. It's not about learning more, it's about surrendering. It is allowing God to enter into the very thoughts that you have not yet been able to organize, the areas that are still confused, the emotions that have not yet aligned. Psalm 139:23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. Now it's no longer about listening, it's about opening. Open your heart, open your mind, open what you may have kept silent for a long time. Let us together enter into a time of prayer where every thought will be placed before God, trusting that He is able to transform, align, and bring peace where there was once confusion. Beloved Father, your presence is the place where our mind finds rest and our heart finds direction. Your word reminds us that there is a peace that goes beyond anything we can understand, and it is in this promise that we place ourselves now with reverence and surrender. Lord, we thank you for this moment, for every word that has been sown, for every teaching that has opened our eyes and touched our interior. Thank you that you don't leave us lost in our own thoughts, but teach us with love to align our minds with your truth. Thank you that even when we don't realize it, the Lord is at work within us, adjusting, healing, and restoring. At this moment, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. Teach us to guard our thoughts, to discern what comes from you, and to reject what does not come. Give us spiritual sensitivity to recognize your voice in the midst of so many other voices. Strengthen our minds so that they are not dominated by fear, doubt, or confusion, but are grounded in your word, which is living and true. Lord, look now at every person who is praying at this time. He who is emotionally tired, bring rest. He who is facing internal battles, bring clarity and peace. He who is dealing with sickness touches with your power and brings healing. The one who faces financial difficulties opens doors and brings provision. The one who lives family conflicts pours out reconciliation, love, and restoration. And for those who feel lost, without direction, reveal your path and rekindle hope. Now, in silence, every heart opens before you. Receive, Lord, every request that is being presented, every pain that has not been said out loud, every thought that needs to be transformed. Father, we commend everything into your hands, every worry, every fear, every doubt, every dream. We set our mind before your altar and declare that it belongs to you. Take control of our thoughts, align everything with your will, and make our mind a place of peace, light, and direction. May every lie be broken now, may all confusion be dispelled, and may your truth prevail within us. May our mind be guarded by you, protected by your presence, and renewed by your Spirit. Philippians 4:7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. May this peace begin to invade every space within us now. May it soothe, align, and strengthen. We trust in you, Lord, and rest in the assurance that you are taking care of everything. And if that prayer expresses what's inside of you, write Amen as a sign of faith, declaring that you surrender your mind and your life into God's hands. In Jesus' name, amen. Throughout everything we have experienced here, one truth has become clear. Your life is shaped by the thoughts you decide to keep. It is not only the circumstances that define your path, but what you allow to remain within you. And today, that message is for you. God chose you to hear this, because there is something He wants to align within your mind. Holding thoughts is not about controlling everything. It is about surrendering, filtering, and allowing God's truth to occupy every space. When you learn to do this, something begins to change from the inside out. Peace ceases to be a distant desire and becomes a present reality. The confusion loses strength, the direction becomes clearer, and your communion with God is strengthened in a profound way. Now, the question that remains is, what thoughts will you continue to feed from today on? I'm very happy to know that we are together on this journey of faith. You are not here by chance, and your presence is part of something bigger. If this message spoke to you, take advantage of this moment to connect even more. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell if you haven't already. And I really want to get to know you better. Write here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. We are forming a chain of faith, and your story matters. It can reach and strengthen other people as well. And it doesn't stop here. What you saw today is just the beginning. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper into how to live a mind that is fully aligned with God, understanding signs that many ignore, and accessing a level of peace that few experience. There is something prepared for you in this continuity, something that can open your eyes in an even deeper way. Don't miss out, because the next step of your transformation is just ahead of you. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.